To the next section, my friends. To the next fucking section. This one's called section IV. I'm sorry, I don't know Roman numerals. Primary elements of human knowledge, or some say knowledge. We're gonna read through, let's see, is it another fucking laboriously long section? Yep. It's pretty fucking long, but guess what, man? Guess what? Oh my god, we're almost out of the introduction. We got like 20 pages? God, we'll see how far we can get with this motherfucker. You ready? I'm not. The advancement of human knowledge we have already seen to be indicated by the progress of accurate generalization. The most ordinary ideas of mankind are the most complex, and the effects of the united process of abstraction and generalization is gradually to simplify them, until we arrive at the ultimate elements of which they consist. We may illustrate this by a reference to the progress of chemical science. The objects of nature by which we are surrounded are extremely complex, and the forms which they assume indefinitely diversified. The chemist begins his research by classifying them under different heads, by noting down certain properties which may in common possess, until he gradually arrives at the knowledge of simpler materials. As his investigation goes on, the analysis becomes more close and accurate, and the ultimate point at which it all tends is to discover the original elements of which the whole material universe consists. In the same manner, the object of the metaphysician is to analyze thought, to reduce the multiplicity of our mental phenomenon to a few general heads. Yeah, okay, like a person that studies the mind, they're going to simplify the idea of what thoughts are by categorizing them. Yes? And thus ultimately to discover this primary elements of which all knowledge consists. Before we enter upon the history of philosophy, therefore, it will be necessary to point out what the primary elements really are. Damn it. Hello? Hey, what's up? Nice. I'm actually doing one now. Okay. Where was I? Before it will be necessary to point out that, okay. I don't know where we ended, so I will read this. Before we enter upon the history of philosophy, therefore, it will be necessary to point out that the primary elements really are, as our classification of the different systems of philosophy will mainly depend upon the view we take to this point. Y'all ready? In deducing these elements, it is not my present intention to go into a full discussion of the question, since this would bring us too rapidly upon the most difficult problems that are to be found in the whole range of metaphysics. As we shall now do is simply to indicate in a few words my ass, the result which have been arrived at by the most acute analysis, and to follow their track until a more clear and correct one shall be pointed out. I'm just like, a few? I doubt it. I really heavily doubt a few. We've got 20 pages to go. Now, in generalizing our knowledge so as to deduce the ultimate elements of which it consists, there are two methods which may be employed. Either we may make a classification of all objective things around us as being the material of our thoughts and feelings, and having reduced them to their most universal heads, regard these as the required elements, or, on the other hand, we may analyze our consciousness, and having reduced the mental phenomena we find there to the smallest possible number, assume these as the elements from which all the multiplicity of our thoughts proceed. The one process consists of a classification of the objects of our knowledge. The other is a dissection of thought in the subjective phases. The former of these methods is well known. was pursued by Aristotle, the first man who undertook the gigantic task of reducing the multiplicity of all the objects of human knowledge for a few general heads. And the result of this attempt was the 10 categories which will ever remain a standing monument of his wonderful power, both of analysis and of generalization. Perhaps it may seem unnecessary to enumerate anything so universally known as these categories, but we give them here to assist the reader in drawing a comparison between the results of Aristotle's investigation on this point and that of some authors who have given other classifications upon different principles. They are as follows: 1. Substance. 2. Quantity. 3. Quality. 4. Relation. 5. Action. 6. Passion. 7. Place. 8. Time. 9. Posture. And 10. Habit. This enumeration is complete in the sense of being all-embracing. There can be but little doubt. It appears impossible to imagine the existence of any object of human thought, externally considered, which might not be fairly reduced to one of these heads. Admitting, therefore, the principle upon which Aristotle proceeds, we may regard his classification not indeed as perfect, since as much closer analysis might be made, but still as being on the score of completedness, eminently successful. So much so, indeed, did it appear to other minds that no improvement upon it was effected for more than 2,000 years. The intellectual effort, however, which Aristotle put forth to deduce the elements of human knowledge was renewed by Kant upon the other, or subjective principle. Instead of looking to the outward materials of our knowledge and seeking the primary elements from an analysis and generalization of these, he looked to the mind itself, inquired into the fundamental conceptions under which everything external must be viewed, and upon these conceptions constructed a complete table of categories. Aristotle had classified the matter of our thoughts. Kant undertook to classify the forms, that one deduces the objective, and the other the subjective elements of human knowledge, admittingly, as did both, that all our ideas must have their raw material from without, and that this material is put into shape and order by the powers or laws of the human understanding. Aristotle, with his sensational tendency, sought to accomplish his object by investigating the former, while Kant, with his ideal tenacity, sought the same object by investigating the latter. In order then to accomplish this purpose, Kant showed that there are 3 great faculties in man, each of which has its own laws or modes of operation. These are, to use a plain English phraseology, sensational, perception, understanding, and pure reason. Sensation gives the matter of our notions. Understanding gives the form, while reason brings unity and connection to the whole exercise of the understanding, and aims ever at the infinite, the unconditioned, the absolute. The forms or categories of sensation are 2, time and space. It is the where and the when that is determined by faculty, since everything we perceive must be that very act we placed in some given time and in some given place. The laws of understanding, which are more peculiarly denominated categories by Kant, are reduced to 12, these 12 falling under 4 general or head categories. Under the head of quantity is 1. We have unity, plurality, and totality. 2. Under the head of quality, we have affirmation, negation, and limitation. 3. Under the head of relation, we have substance, causality, reciprocatory. Reciprocity, well, that's a weird way to say that, and reciprocity. And lastly, under the head of modality are contained possibility, actuality, and necessity. These are according to Kant. the 12 concepts in relation to which everything really exists must be viewed. Then lastly comes the highest faculty of man, that of pure reason, the form of which is absolutely unity, and which, according as it is directed to substance, or to phenomena, or to the ideal of perfection, leads to the three irreducible ideas of the soul, the absolute subject of the universe, the totality of all phenomenon, and God, the all-perfect essence. So you have the three essences, what he's talking about. That sounds interesting. Soul is the absolute subject, universe is the phenomena, and God is the perfect essence. Interesting. To sum up then the whole analysis which Kant gives us of our intellectual nature, or as he would term them, modes of our intellectual being, we have 2 for our sensational faculty, 12 of the understanding, and 3 by which reason strives after absolute unity is in its ideas, making it all 17 categories. The fuller explanation of Kant's doctrine of the categories we must leave till we come to the consideration of the Kantian philosophy in its proper place. The influence of Kant in Germany drew the attention of philosophers mainly to one point, which he had treated with so great skill and acuteness, namely, the determination of the fundamental laws of thought, or the primary elements of our intellectual being. As the analysis became more close, doubts were entertained as to the correctness of his classification. The number of these fundamental laws, or primary elements, became thus gradually reduced, and the foundations of intellectual science by degree confines within narrower limits. The history of this process will be pointed out more particularly hereafter. The fruits of it, to which only we can now refer, have been abundantly reaped, and still further matured, by one of the first of living philosophers, M. Cousin, who's not living anymore, who with singular depth and clearness had criticized labors of Kant, and by the application of all the rigor of more modern analysis, has reduced the whole of the Kantian categories to 2 fundamental ideas. According to Cousin, then, all of our thoughts may be reduced to the 2 primitive ideas of action and being, the one giving the category of causality, the other of substance. The one implying the relative, the contingent, and the particular, the phenomenon. The other implying the absolute, the necessary, the universal, the infinite, without entering into the abstruse details by which the categories of Kant are referred to these heads. It may be sufficient to point out how these 2 fundamental ideas are deduced, and what they severely contain. That's a weird way to say that. And perhaps it is impossible to give this deduction in clearer and more concentrated language than that which has been employed by M. Cousin himself. The human reason, he says, is whatever matter it develops itself, whatever it grasps, on whatever it meditates, whether it stops short of the observation of surrounding nature, or whether it penetrates into the depths of the inward world, conceives of all things under the type of 2 ideas. If it examines number and quantity, it is impossible for it to see anything there more than unity and multiplicity, the one and the diverse, the one and the multiple, unity and plurality. These are the 2 elementary ideas of reason, in which every consideration relative to number terminates. If it occupies itself with space, it can only conceive of it under 2 points of view, those, namely, of bounded or determined space on the one side, of absolute space on the other. If it occupies itself with the existence, if it views things under the sole respect that they are, it can only conceive of the idea of absolute existence, or the idea of relative existence. Does it think of time? It conceives, that's a weird, does it think of time? It conceives either the time as determined, time properly so called, or of time in itself, absolute time, namely eternity, in the same manner as absolute space is immensity. Does it think of forms? It conceives either a form that is finite, determined, limited, measurable, or of something which is the principle of this form, which is neither measurable, nor limited, nor finite. In a word, it conceives of infinite. If it thinks of movement or action, it can only conceive of limited action, and the source of limited action, of powers and causes that are bounded, relative, and secondary, on the one hand, or of an absolute power, a first cause, on the other, beneath which it respects of action. It is not possible to seek or to find anything. If it thinks of all exterior and internal phenomena, which develops themselves around us, of this whole moving scene of events and accidents of every kind, there again it can only conceive of two things, the manifestation and appearance, as simply appearance and simple manifestation, or of that which, while it appears, retains something that does not pass away in the appearing, that is, of being in itself. Or, to take the language of science, we have conceived the phenomenon and substance. In thought again, it conceives of thoughts which refer to this thing, or that, which may be or may not be. And it conceives of principles of thought in itself, the principle which exists without doubt in all of our relative thoughts, but which is never exhausted. In the moral world, it conceives of certain things as beautiful or good, and then it inevitably brings there also these same categories of finite and infinite, which become now the perfect and the imperfect. This is something I've never heard of, by the way, the beau-real and the beau-ideal, virtues which the mysteries of reality, or the saint in his elevation and unsullied purity. These, as it appears to me, adds M. Cousin, are all the elements of human reason. The outward world, the intellectual world, the moral world, all are subjected to these two ideas. Reason only develops, and can only develop itself on these two conditions. The great division of ideas now universally accepted into contingent and necessary ideas. I fucking hate making mistakes as an motherfucker. This division, in a more circumstantial point of view, is the reflex of that at which I stop, and which you can represent yourselves under the formula of unity and multiplicity, of substance and phenomenon, of absolute cause and relative cause, of the perfect and imperfect, of the finite and infinite. Such is M. Cousin's ultimate reduction of the primary elements of all our knowledge. As however the category of causality contains in it two very important and very distinct ideas, it may be as well to give another and simpler deduction of these great fundamental conceptions of the human mind, one which may, perhaps, place the whole question in a somewhat clearer light. The first and most obvious idea that we possess within our consciousness is that of our own existence. The notion of self, or the me, as it has been so often and so significantly termed, must necessarily be a primitive and a universal notion, since it is implied in the every perception we experience. In every thought we create, in a word, in every mental act we perform, we all feel conscious that there is something we call ourselves. Here's where we get into the good stuff, finally, which possesses and can exert power, and to which, as a fundamentally unity, all the multiplicity of our thoughts and feelings are to be referred. This power, however, or energy, which we variously call the will, the acting and knowing principle, or the me, is not an infinite and absolute power. On the contrary, it finds itself bounded, resisted, and opposed on every side. There is not an effort we put forth, but we find it limited and circumscribed by some counter force, which we are conscious really exists, and which acts upon us independently of ourselves. No sooner do we become cognizant of self and the power we possess of willing and acting, than we find all around a world that offers resistance to us at every point, together with phenomena and laws that often seem directly or in contradiction to our own volitions, and which, if not attended to, would instantly involve us in suffering and death. To the idea of self there stands opposed, therefore, the idea of something which is not self, or, as it has been otherwise expressed, the me, finds around it other existences that are separate from us, and which therefore we may term the not me as being the most general phrase by which it can be denominated. The one of these ideas indeed supposes and involves the other. We could have no distinct notion of self, but as opposed to and separate from other existences around us. Nor could we have any notion of an external world, but as something which is opposed to and separate from ourselves. These then are the two of the most fundamental ideas of human mind, that of self on the one side, with its intelligence, its liberty, and that of a physical world on the other, with its power of inertia, a word of whose law we are some extended subject, in which we have by mingled obedience and resistance to bend and mold to our necessities and desires. So far, however, we are not yet out of the region of finite. The me, as we have seen, is limited in its action and volitions by the not me. It is a finite cause that can be resisted and changed variously by other causes which act around it. Nature, too, is finite. It can only oppose us to a limited extent, and we can in our turn resist and modify it. Both of these ideas, therefore, come under the notion of the relative, the limited, the bounded, the finite, the phenomenal, and both equally belong to the category of causality, the former being voluntary or intentional cause, the other a blind and fatal one. These two general ideas, however, which we have thus placed under the category of causality, by no means exhaust all the material of thought that exists in the human mind. Do you want to go into that little, footnote part? Let's try it. The division of the me and the not me would certainly appear to be exhausted at first sight, and with regards to finite existences so. But when we come to consider absolute existence, we can no more refer it to the one than to the other. Self and nature both lie embosomed in the infinite. The me and the not me equally partake of the absolute in their essence. And it is in this view of the cause that to these two finite conceptions we add the idea of the infinite, as in which they both subsist. To include the absolute in the not me, as some propose, would be to exclude an absolute ground from the idea of humanity. This we cannot admit. Going back to it, they're saying, these two general ideas, however, which we have thus placed under the category of causality, by no means exhaust all the materials of thought that exists in the human mind. Just in the same manner as the me implies the notion of a not me, from which it is distinguished, and by the perception of which we become conscious of our own separate individuality in the whole universe of things around us. So the notion of limited and finite implies the correlative one of the limited and the infinite. Let any one attentively examine his own inmost thoughts, and he will find that there can be no distinct idea whether in the mind, without the implication of something else from which it is separated. So, you are within your mind because you understand the idea that you cannot be because things are without it? Is that what you're trying to say? Every distinct idea must be defined. That is, it must be bounded off from other ideas, the existence of which ideas is accordingly supposed by very facts of definition. Take the idea of relative and see whether it would convey any notion to the mind whatever, unless the idea of absolute exists at that to which it is opposed. What again were the notion of finite without the correlative one of infinite? Or what of multiplicity without that of unity? Now, if we take the category of causality in any of the different phases, under which we have presented it, we find that in every case there is a correlative, I think is what I'm supposed to be saying, and an opposite notion, which we must place in what we have termed the category of substance, i.e., of the infinite and unchangeable, or the being per se. If we consider the world of phenomena, we are necessitating by our reason itself to suppose and admit some substance in which these phenomena adhere, and which remains ever essentially the same amidst all the changes that may appear on the surface. If we think cause, we are unable to imagine it without admitting the existence of some being, from which the power, variously displayed, emanates. If we think of events, we cannot conceive of them without time, the one immeasurable duration in which all events exist. If we think of objects as they lie in space around us, we are obliged to refer to them to a universal space that envelops all the visible in its vast embrace. In all these instances, the two categories penetrate each other, so that one notion only becomes possible by the opposition which the other throws out before our own view. The same principal ideas which we have deduced by foregoing process arise equally before our view when we confine our attention to the subjective world and analyze the phenomenon of our own mental faculties. The mind of man is the mirror of the universal nature, and whatever exists accessible to us in the whole region of being, material or spiritual, we find imagined in us with the most perfect accuracy. Man possesses a sensational faculty, and to what does this point us? Manifestly to the object existence of an external world, the varied form of which are, by means of this faculty, made accessible to our own minds. Man possesses, moreover, intelligence. He possesses the power of volition. He possesses impulses, desires, affections, and all these phenomena imply the existence of a subject to which they alike belong. Intelligence is my intelligence. It is the comprehension of things as I have classified and generalized them for my own use and convenience. Volition is my volition, and so also are the various desires and impulses my own subject feels, those which I myself experience and which no one else can experience precisely in the same manner. Here then we find our own faculties pointing out to us by their very constitution the existence of two realities. In the one case, that of the being I term self; the other case, that of the external world which is distinguished by self and opposed to it. In both cases, however, we are kept down within the region of the finite and of the relative, for neither sensation nor understanding, nor our desires or volition lead us directly to the region of absolute and eternal. If we look a little further, however, we find that man has the faculty of perceiving absolute and necessary truth, as well as which is relative and infinite. That there are ideas within us which come neither through the channel of the senses nor are dependent upon the peculiar constitution of our own minds, but which are the clear reflection within us of absolute and eternal realities. In the case of sensation, I perceive objects which might or might not be, objects which may yet be changed and modified in 1,000 different ways. In simple understanding, I observe relations which might or which might not exist, relations perhaps which I have artificially made of my own use, and which I can easily destroy. In every case of volition, the resolution to which I come is strictly my own, i.e. the fruit of my own will. But far otherwise is it with everything belonging to the pure and absolute reason. Take, for instance, an axiomatic truth of pure mathematics. It is not thought mere sensation that you have arrived at it, neither is it an arbitrary relation of your own production, nor is it conceived of its pursuance of any resolution of your own will. Try as you may, and you cannot after the conception of pure reason, even to an infinitesimal degree. My sensations are my own, and my volitions are my own. But truth, absolute truth, is not mine or yours. Neither is it within the bounds of our possible belief that it should be different to any rational mind from what it is to ours. Absolute truth has no element of personality in it, and our reason, therefore, as far as it grasps the necessitary and the external. It is strictly speaking impersonal reason. So reason's without us, is what you're trying to say. Truth, reason, the real fucking truth and reason is without us. It is the reflection within ourselves of external things as they are, an emanation of rays of the infinite reason, which governs the universe by laws of unerring wisdom and truth, and which, as far as it is manifested at all is manifested to every mind alike. Here, then, we are led again to the same virtual conclusion, that the three great and primary elements of our knowledge are, firstly, the idea of our own individual existence, or of finite mind in general; secondly, the idea of nature; and thirdly, the idea of the absolute and eternal, as manifested in pure conception of our impersonal reason. Every notion of our intellectual life, we believe, may be traced to one of these sources, and we regard them, therefore, as the primitive elements of all our knowledge, starting points from which every truth system of intellectual philosophy must take its risk, or rise. It is to the method, then, by which the different philosophical systems have grounded themselves upon these fundamental ideas that we must now briefly revert. Okay, so after that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more pages to go of the introduction, and then we can get back into the actual fucking book. So let us keep in mind those things that it discusses, I guess, you know? You have self, you have the idea of what you are, and what that is manifested within your mind, within your head, within your being. And that's finite, it's small, it's not, it comes to the source within of itself, which is different from this infinite universal truth. So it's like a consciousness of people is all separated, but we have possibly, it's either concluding some sort of source to all of our consciousnesses, or it's saying, no, this source of whatever truth may be, the idea of what phenomena is and what's behind it, is separate from anything that mankind is within himself. So me personally, you personally, and everyone around you has their own kind of, what it sounds like, self-awareness, the us, the idea of like, I know what I know, and through my knowledge I gain the understanding of how to categorize what I need for myself. Well, this is saying that that's its own separate thing. I have that, you have that, we all have that. This truth, this universal truth, is without that. Now, how can that be connected? Is that connected possibly through the consciousness of human beings? Can we all, within what the idea of I try to explore, unity consciousness, can it be obtained there? Or is truth outside of consciousness? I wonder that now. So it's like, you know, when like you meditate and you kind of come close to some sort of what feels to be truth. It feels like if you meditate and you get to this state, it's something speaking to you that's outside of yourself, right? Some people say they get that from those, ayahuasca or fucking mushrooms and shit. That might be what they're kind of getting at, that's outside of our consciousness, because the idea, at least my understanding of it, of meditation, is to let go of that consciousness and to be at one, to be at peace, to stop the mind from doing all this stuff and just being in the moment. It's getting as close as possible to death without actually dying. And from that point, it seems as if you can understand some kind of knowledge. Remember when I told you that video where I was like, you are the conduit? Well, that was obtained by going without my own consciousness. So I believe that something outside of me spoke to me saying this. Was that within myself already, or was it not? That I cannot prove. But my thinking is, this right here is the moment in which we can understand that ultimate truth that can be connected to what God is, or what in like this perfected being is, or something that we'll never fathom. That is outside of our human consciousness, either as a collective or as an individual. Something to think about, right? As usual, just go back and re-listen and fucking find your shit, man. Like, I don't know who's with me on this shit. I don't even know. I don't know. But on this journey, man, I think we could find some sort of truth, some sort of idea. We have to, you know, like there's if we're going this fucking far, clearly there's, I don't know, like if you're coming with me this far into it, we're setting on a fucking journey. So I think it's a cool idea to discuss things in the comment section if there's anyone that's fucking there. I don't know, because sometimes it'll tell me in the videos, like, yeah, people watch about 2 minutes of this and they fucking leave. I'm like, yeah, I can understand that. I should have a disclaimer. I'm like, it's a fucking reading. Don't be ready for fucking graphics and animations, okay? It's a human thing. It's not some bullshit. But I don't, because you gotta weed people out, you know? Yeah, so if feeling like discussing this, I'm down. I'm down, dude, with whatever we do. We'll see. I think it's starting to make more sense now. I feel like we had to kind of get through a lot of bullshit. Now, there may be nuggets that I miss, but in my mind, I'm like, duh. You said it in a very long-winded way, but yeah, no shit. So it's starting to kind of get to where I'm finding interest again. So there's only one more section, and then from that section, we're off into the actual fucking book, which will be exciting, hopefully.